All right, welcome. In this video, before we get into talking about artificial neural networks, I want to talk a little bit about biological neural networks, that is, neurons and the brains as they exist in animals. The animal brain and the nervous system, or the system of nerves that usually go throughout an animal's body, are a large network of cells, specifically neurons or nerve cells, that, as I mentioned, are connected to one another to send messages throughout your body. A neuron itself is a single cell, and it has a couple different components. It's got sort of its main cell body. All cells sort of have to carry out normal behaviors of a living cell, bringing in resources, expelling waste, and carrying out certain metabolic processes. But the neuron also carries out very specific processes for sending and receiving messages, and so it has specific components that it utilizes for those roles. So, for instance, one of these components are called dendrites, which are sort of small filaments that connect onto a cell or onto a neuron from other neurons. Or the dendrites are the part that receive the signal from those other neurons into this present neuron cell, and then this neuron might want to send signals to other neurons, and it does so by sending a signal along its axon, and then that signal might be distributed from its axon along some synapses to other neurons, where it will be read by their dendrites. And so these different components of a neuron are functional and are important in the functioning of biological brains and nervous systems. A lot of these functional components are things that we are ultimately going to abstract away as computer scientists, recognizing that maybe specific neurotransmitters and the specific way that a neuron actually sends these messages might not be as important as the fact that it does send messages and how it is connected to these other neurons. So to begin our investigation of nervous systems and brains, I want to explore some of the simpler nervous systems that exist in the animal kingdom. And I'm starting here with a jellyfish, but we could have gone a little bit simpler down to a roundworm or flatworm or a tardigrade. Those organisms have maybe a few hundred neurons, and they're pretty interesting too. But I did want to share the jellyfish, because the jellyfish is one of the larger organisms that still has a nervous system, a connection of nerve cells, which is sometimes called a nerve net at this level, but it doesn't have any brain. And so its nervous system can be still be quite large, maybe consisting of, as it says here, a few thousand cells, let's say 5,000 nerve cells. But those nerve cells are distributed throughout the jellyfish's body, and it is used mostly so that the jellyfish can respond to stimuli. But there's no centralized controller. There's no brain in the middle that's deciding, okay, move these limbs over here now, move those ones over here later. Each limb is sort of independently deciding on its own, oh, I should move, I should do something. And so even with a very simple structure like that, no centralized controller, jellyfish and other very simple sea life like jellyfish can still have very simple behaviors where they respond to stimuli. The most important one, of course, being finding food and moving towards it, or moving away from anything dangerous that might be around. And it is sufficient for at least jellyfish life forms to have just a very simple nervous system like this. Now, maybe leaping ahead a little bit, jumping up into the insect kingdom and arriving at one of my favorite insects to study, which are ants. We can look at an individual ant, and we can maybe look at its nervous system. Its complete nervous system might have somewhere around the order of 250,000 neurons. And it starts to have a small centralized proto-brain. It still has largely what we might call a nerve net, like a jellyfish, but its nerve net is going to be more sophisticated, where certain bundles of nerves that might be related to, say, controlling a limb or something like, or bringing in some input. These are often called ganglia in insects, And these ganglia are distributed throughout the animal's body, but also there's going to be a small connection of ganglia that are in a centralized location, where you might expect a brain to be. What that handles things like centralized control, which might mean moving my limbs in a coordinated pattern so that I can walk in a coordinated way, and also to bringing in the input and organizing that input, stimuli from our sensors in some important way so that it can be distributed to make decisions. So those, you might think of this as the beginning, a primitive brain or a proto-brain. Insects have something that you might call like a brain-like structure, but is still not quite the brain that we see in more advanced life forms. Now, one thing I do want to say about insects, which is one of the reasons or ants in particular, one of the reasons I find them very fascinating, is that ants typically are organized into these elaborate colonies, and these colonies have a lot of behaviors on a colony level that no individual ant is sort of smart enough to carry out on its own. And so we might actually think of the brain of the colony as actually being much larger than the brain of any one individual ant. And so maybe we'll flash ahead a little bit. Maybe if we had a colony here, we have 250,000 neurons in a single ant. Maybe we have 1,000 ants. That means we're now up to 250 million neurons in 1,000 ants. And so the amount of processing that 250 million neurons might be able to do might be way more sophisticated than just the simple ants. Now, of course, that's probably going to be more powerful if all of those neurons were in one brain, but ants have interesting ways of sending messages to one another that allow them to communicate just maybe in the same way that we were just discussing neurons do. So maybe the neurons allow them to plant some signals in their environment that other ants are able to pick up that trigger their neurons, and in sort of a telepathic way, well, not quite telepathic, but in the same way that we're communicating now by putting in words or symbols into the environment, making sound waves, those sound waves then arriving in your own mind. Ants are able to send messages from one another in this way. So I like to think, each individual ant is fairly sophisticated and interesting, but as a colony, there's there's sort of an order of magnitude more complexity added to that system. So moving, again, maybe another order of magnitude up from the insect world, we can move into the world of fish. And fish have it depends on which fish you're looking at, but maybe from about 1 million up to 10 million different neurons. And fish are starting to have some of the specialized nervous system components that we see in ourselves and other higher animal life. For instance, they now have something that we will call a brain, not like the ants where we might call it sort of a proto-brain or a primitive brain. They have a brain with specialized regions that allow them to carry out learning and have memory and perform more sophisticated behaviors like navigation. So fish definitely have a brain. The other thing they have are they're vertebrates, meaning they have a spinal cord. That the spinal cord is a very important sort of highway in which neural messages can be transmitted. And to your different parts of your body, the nerve net that we were talking about in those lower life forms still exists in higher life form when we use it to control our limbs and to get information from those limbs as well. And so the way that messages are communicated are along the spinal cord, and of course that's going to be a very important piece of hardware for us, and we want to keep it protected, and that's where the actual spine comes in as sort of a important bone protective case for that spinal cord and for those messages, so that hopefully it does not get damaged and impair the behavior of the animal. So fish are a good example of sort of our first set of vertebrates that have now got what we might call a complex nervous system, where we have different maybe levels of control. We have the centralized controller of the brain, then we have like a bus-like architecture in the spinal cord, and then we have more of our normal nerve net that we saw in our lower life forms controlling individual limbs and so on. Now moving again up through the animal life, we might move now into reptile life. Reptiles are known for, again, having a specialized brain structure, just like the fish. They also are vertebrates, so they have a spinal cord and so on. However, reptiles have had time to evolve those structures along more dimensions, so that their brains are larger. They're more complex, with more complex, specialized structures within them, allowing for, again, the same kind of behaviors in terms of memory and response to stimuli. However, one thing that we start seeing in reptiles more than we see in fish is a lot more articulated limbs. So not only do we have sort of legs, but at the end of those legs there might be claws, which are smaller articulated limbs. And to be able to control those limbs, you need, on the one hand, a more sophisticated nerve net that embodies those limbs, but then we need a more sophisticated controller that tells those limbs what to do. That is, the brain needs to be more sophisticated to do that. So reptiles have definitely got a more evolved brain than a fish in this sense. And a lot of the other life forms we'll look at here, birds and mammals and so on, have evolved from reptiles, and as a result, our brain structure have many similarities to reptiles, but we also have components that reptiles lack. And so sometimes when we talk about the brains of mammals, birds, or humans, we might talk about part of the brain, and we might refer to it as a reptile brain, and that's the part of the brain that remains there that remains as part of our brain through evolution, and it still is used. It's not sort of an archaic part that we don't use. The kinds of things that it's used for in higher life forms are automatic responses to stimuli that we might not want our cognitive brain to spend some time thinking about. So for instance, if you've ever had sort of a dark shape loom over you, you might flinch out of the way naturally without thinking about it. That's probably your reptile brain taking control, saying, okay, that's a potential danger there. Let's move ourselves out of the way. And of course, why do we have that kind of reflex? Well, often you want to respond very quickly to a danger of that kind without deliberating about it and allowing your slower brain to spend time on it, which is one reason why reptile brains are still important to mammalian life and bird life, all other creatures that may have evolved from reptiles. All right, I mentioned bird life, so one of those creatures that is evolved from reptiles are birds. And birds are also one of the more intelligent life forms on the planet. So again, their brains now were into the region of hundreds of millions. So maybe that Nile crocodile we were just looking at might cap out at about 100 million. Birds are now, in order of magnitude 2 to 10 times larger than the crocodile in terms of the number of neurons on their brain, and even adjusted for size, of course. Typically, larger animals have larger brains. That's a pretty simple rule to follow. But a lot of birds, of course, are much smaller than a Nile crocodile, nonetheless having more neurons in their brains and nervous system. I've got here sort of an African parrot. African parrots are well known for being able to vocalize, that is, learn words, and not just learn words, but learn the meanings of words. So that is, being able to apply them with semantic content, not just syntactic content. That is, they can they can learn colors of things, they can learn the material that things are made of, and the names of things, of specific things that they can identify by shape or feel or other characteristics. And so this is, of course, really impressive intellectual behavior. It's not something that they do on their own necessarily that we're aware of at this point. However, birds do have very sophisticated songs, and there are many birds that have songs that they learn from their family or their community. and they pass on to their children in that way. And we know this by identifying different cultures of song culture. When you move from one colony of birds to another, they might sing different songs. And so, again, very sophisticated structures at play here, allowing birds to learn all kinds of things, have relationships with one another, and with other animals as well. This kind of brings us into the life of mammals, where mammals, like birds, have a lot of those very sophisticated structures that allow them to learn all kinds of interesting things about their environment. Not just what good food to eat, what's likely to harm us, and so on. But mammals can have very sophisticated social lives. So, for instance, in a lion pride like this, there are going to be relationships that are formed between different members of that tribe, often depending on their sex. So, there might be one male who's sort of the alpha, and there are a lot of females. There might be some younger males in the pride that are maybe the alpha males' relatives, usually sons, often maybe brothers or other relatives. And of course, those social relationships evolve in very complex ways. So if one of those adolescent lions grows up as the alpha is getting a little bit older, there might be a challenge in those communities. The alpha might be forced out or killed, so that to make place for a younger one. So all of these very complicated relationships are things that their mammalian brains are able to keep track of. They're able to remember who's at what stage in the social structure of their band, and use that to make decisions about should I confront this other lion, or should I back down in this particular conflict because I suspect that they're stronger than me, or maybe have more allies among the pride than I do. So those kind of sophisticated decision-making, social decision-making, are on top of course, a very sophisticated suite of behavioral adaptations, allowing them, of course, the lions that we have depicted here are also very proficient hunters, and they do that with some limbs that they can control with an amazing efficiency. So again, the nervous system is very important for that. Another thing that wildcats are well known for is the speed of their reflexes, so the ability for them to respond very quickly to something that they can see. Again, their reflexes likely being faster than even ours. So very interesting complexes that are built into mammalian brains. And of course, if we start pushing those mammalian brains as close as we can get to ourselves without getting to humans, we end up in the primates, and more specifically in the great apes. So here I've depicted a chimpanzee. And great apes, I say here, have some of the largest brains in the animal kingdom. Okay, so 28 billion in chimpanzees on average, 33 billion for orangutans and gorillas, again, on average. We probably shouldn't read too much into that difference. They're very closely related, and chimpanzees are smaller, of course, than gorillas and orangutans, and that's probably sufficient to explain the difference. Also, between those three great apes, chimpanzees are the closest to us genetically, so we suspect that the human lineage sort of broke off from the chimpanzee lineage, I think about 2 million years ago, maybe a little longer than that. And that since then we've both evolved, in different directions. But as a result, chimpanzees are also very close to us in many, many regards. I mean, they kind of look at us. If they weren't so hairy, they also have behaviors that are very similar to human behaviors if you spend enough time observing them. And in fact, what's really exciting about great apes is that they have cultures. They definitely have cultures. They even have tools. And if you move from one band, you go across the river and you find another band of chimpanzees, they may be eating a completely different kind of food, and the way they harvest that food might be completely different, and the way that they interact with the other bands around them might be completely different. So some might be more violent and territorial, where others are more permissive and exchange members and so on. So all of these differences we might call them proto-culture if we try and evaluate them from the standpoint of human culture, but they are certainly social patterns and social traditions that are passed on from generation to generation among chimpanzees, and we can see in them very similar behaviors to ourselves, and maybe find clues as to how humans started along their path of evolution to where we arrived at today. Now, I do say here that they have some of the largest brains in the animal kingdom, but again, there are a couple animals that are much larger than us that even still have larger brains. One that comes to mind is the elephant. Elephants are also mammals, of course, and they are very intelligent, long-lived mammals that can remember all kinds of things. They also have cultures passed on from their elders. The elders in an elephant troop are often the sources of all the deep knowledge. They remember where the good watering holes are, even in times of drought. Even if drought has not occurred for 20 years, they will remember where to go in case of drought to find the good watering holes. And so these, there are other animals, and I haven't really touched on a lot of ocean life, but of course among porpoises and whales, there are a large number of really sophisticated and intelligent creatures that also have brains, at least comparable in size to the great apes and humans, and in some cases larger, because also many of these animals are much larger than a human or a chimpanzee. And that leads us to us. That's sort of where we get to, which is humans. And again, if we're looking in comparison to our closest relatives, the chimpanzees, who had about 28 billion neurons, humans have on average about 86 billion neurons. So that's still a considerable growth, about 3 to 4 times more neurons. And it's really interesting as well to see how quickly it was that our brains developed those extra neurons. So, getting to chimpanzees from those very first organisms that had neurons, it took many, many billions of years. But to get from chimpanzees to humans and get those next 70 billion or 60 billion neurons added, it took us only about a couple million years. And that's because there must be some really strong selection pressure on human brains to make them want to grow bigger and better. And to get to that point, I want to explain a couple of really interesting experiments that have been conducted on great apes to try and understand what may have led to us having that rapid increase in brain size. So I mentioned that chimpanzees in the wild have a culture, but we've also undergone experiments, especially in the last 100 years, to try and train great apes with our cultures in ways that we can get them to maybe learn, for instance, language. And there have been some successes with gorillas and chimpanzees, and I'm sure with other great apes as well, but these are the ones I'm more familiar with. There's been a gorilla, quite famously named Coco, that learned sign language and can communicate with a couple hundred signs in American Sign Language. And then the story that I do want to share with you is another one about a chimpanzee, a bonobo chimpanzee, I believe, which is just a cousin of the more common chimpanzees. And this bonobo's name was Kenzie, and was a young bonobo who was part of a program where they were trying to train these bonobo chimpanzees to use sort of a keyboard-like communication device that kind of had pictures on them that maybe represented different words, and then the chimpanzees could sort of press these keys to cause speech to happen, a robotic speech to happen, and they could use that to communicate with their caretakers if they wanted and ask for bananas or toys or hugs or whatever it is that they wanted. And it didn't have full sentence structure, but it allowed them to communicate simple desires and communicate other things like that. And so they were trying to train these bonobos to use this, and Kenzie was actually not one of the subjects of this experiment. Kenzie was not being trained. It was Kenzie's mother that was being trained, and Kenzie's mother was spent a lot of time after giving birth to Kenzie in these trials, trying to learn how to use this keyboard, and getting rewarded with treats and so on. And while Kenzie's mother was being trained, Kenzie would usually be with Kenzie's mother, and that's just because Kenzie was very young at this stage, and it was best for Kenzie to be there. So Kenzie was involved in the training sessions, though was not actively being trained. Now, as a result, and through hindsight and hypothesis, this is maybe thought to be because Kenzie was young when this training was going on. Kenzie learned quite well how to use the communication device, and also the thing that's maybe remarkable about Kenzie is that not only did Kenzie learn how to use the communication device quite well, Kenzie's understanding of the words and the symbols and how they related to the world restructured how Kenzie thought about the world. And so Kenzie was a little bit more sophisticated in certain tasks than Kenzie's peers, others that might have also been trained on the table and also might be pretty good at the table. Kenzie had a different way of interacting with both the human caretakers and the other chimpanzees. One of the interesting examples of this was a case where one of the caretakers had asked Kenzie for a hug, and of course Kenzie understands English intention quite well, because by restructuring their brain, they're able to understand what the meaning is behind human words. And so if you go and ask Kenzie for a hug, Kenzie knows what you want and will give you a hug. And this day, Kenzie was with another one of their peers, and the caretaker had asked the peer, the other chimpanzee, please give me a hug. And the other chimpanzee maybe understood, but again, they don't always, even when they understand, they don't necessarily respond with the human level of understanding and say, oh, okay, I'll give you a hug. They might not care to give you a hug, just like a human, honestly, but they might just be like, I'm not into this game right now, so whatever you're trying to do. So for whatever reason, this other chimpanzee had no desire to give the caretaker a hug. But after asking for a hug a couple of times, Kenzie, who is a little bit, more there, can understand what's going on and sees kind of like the frustration, almost shares the frustration of the caretaker not getting a hug. And in this moment, Kenzie grabs the arms of the other chimpanzee and kind of lifts them up and puts them around the caretaker in order to sort of show them, this is what you're supposed to be doing. This is how you get involved. And it just shows that these great apes, that while in their normal natural life cycle may not engage in language and communication in the same depth or level that humans do, there's something in their brains already that if we can turn it on, if we can trigger it, they can be quite sophisticated in their language use. And what I start to hypothesize and imagine when I start thinking about human evolution, something I think about a lot, is imagine that Kenzie had evolved naturally in their tribe of chimpanzees or humans in the early days to a level, for whatever reason, had been triggered to start thinking about their world in terms of symbols, and using that symbolization of their world to just start reasoning. It doesn't even have to be very sophisticated reasoning, just slightly more sophisticated reasoning. That particular individual would likely have an advantage over their peers from an evolutionary standpoint. And it is this advantage that a lot of researchers believe started the rapid progression towards brain growth in human beings, which is that part of our brain that allows us to do that socialization, to remember who our peers are, to remember who's been loyal to us, who's been disloyal. All of those parts are important in recognizing social dominance in these early chimpanzee tribes and in human tribes and so on. And so if you were someone in that tribe who was better equipped at understanding all the interrelations by having maybe a more evolved brain, then you probably had an advantage in that group, and not only within that group. So imagine now that you've spread that particular advantage to some of your peers, your colleagues, maybe there's a family of you now, but that group itself is going to be so much more well equipped than other groups that maybe haven't made this transition yet. And this kind of positive feedback loop is likely what led to the massive growth of the human brain. Okay, so we've done a little exploration of neurons and brains and how they exist in the animal kingdom, and how maybe, hypothesis at least, of how we may have arrived at human brains. But the purpose of this was to help us understand that neurons, very simply, are very simple cells. Themselves are not very sophisticated. Even a nerve net of a few thousand of them, empowering a jellyfish, are not super sophisticated when compared to the network that exists inside of a human. But maybe we can harness that power from a computational standpoint and create a network of very simple devices, let's call them artificial neurons, that we can use to build some kind of intelligent device. So maybe not a jellyfish or a human, but maybe something like that. And since we're on the topic of biological life forms, some of those very simplest life forms, a flatworm or a roundworm, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, with having only maybe 100 neurons, a couple hundred neurons, some of those animals, we've already completely mapped out their brains, nervous systems, nerve nets, and we've actually gone ahead and re-simulated those nervous systems inside of a computer, inside of a computer simulation, and have been able to identify that yes, indeed, we can make these little simulated worms move towards food and away from harm and so on. So this is sort of an interesting first step. And in our next video, I want us to talk about what is an artificial neuron and what can an artificial neuron do maybe, and what can it not do, before talking about artificial neural networks. So thanks a lot for watching, and we'll see you in that next video.